In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the process of how to look at a journal article and decide, hey, is this something I can actually gain value from? Is it trash? Or does it fall somewhere in between? So that you can make choices of, hey, this is great data, or actually, I'm going to pass. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Liz. I'm a family nurse practitioner. And if you have been around for a minute, you know this is the weirdest video probably for me to ever make because all I do is rant about how much I hate the research classes and yada, yada, yada in nursing and NP school. However, upon reflection, I realized it's something that it's a very useful tool, learning how to read research, understand research, and then implement it into practice. And I've gotten a lot of people asking me, how do you even do this? And I looked and I couldn't find a video, so I'm gonna try to make one. I am not an expert on this. I am not a researcher. This is just some basic things you should definitely know before going in and looking at a research paper. If you guys have other tidbits of things you always look for in research papers, please leave them down below because as you know, I mean, I am comfortable reading them, but this is not my specialty. But here we are. I hope you can gain a little bit of something and leave just feeling a little bit more confident. So for the purposes of today's video, I'm going to walk you through the different things of how I analyze a research paper. We're going to use an imaginary research paper just as our guide, just to give us a little context. So for the sake of today, the research hypothesis we're working with is, does brushing your teeth lead to fewer cavities? Okay, and we'll just refer back to that just as kind of our example so that some of these things make a little bit more sense. Now, as I'm sure you're very well aware, we are living in a world where there are a lot of different research articles and all over social media, everyone's like, do your research and find your studies. But it's really hard to tell. There you can make a research study about anything, slap a couple facts together and really make some interesting claims that are not backed up by great data. So the goal here is just to teach you, help you realize oh, this is good data versus oh, wow, yikes. We'll talk about red flags, all that good stuff. Now, the very first thing we're going to do when we're looking at this data is, where was it published? When you're looking at data, you want your journal article to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, preferably a peer-reviewed journal that has somewhat of a good reputation. Now I know your next question is, what's a peer-reviewed journal with somewhat of a good reputation? And honestly, there's a lot. Too many to go around and count, and I don't want to miss ones that are good that I just didn't get a hold of. But in general, things you can look for are, is it associated with a school or a particular part of society? So cardiologists or kidney doctors or family nurse practitioners, does it have somewhat of a focus? And is that associated with some kind of other society or group or, formal association of similar people? You also want the journal to kind of have a focus, but not be too niche. A journal about teeth, great. A journal just about cavities and one specific type of where it gets so focused, that might be them getting a little bit too narrow focused, and then you can start to wonder what are your actual motives here? Not always, but just sometimes. Some examples of some very well-known ones are the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet. You don't have to be associated with a large medical association to be a great journal, but a lot of them do have some kind of affiliation with some kind of academic or professional society. And then what does peer review mean? Peer review just means that other people who are also in this sphere have looked at the data that you presented in your research article, and they said, yeah, that looks like a good conclusion that you drew from that data. It seems like the study was well done. I will vouch for that. This whole, is this a good journal, is one of the murkier areas because, like I said, there's just a lot of areas for it. Your proofreaders, your peers could be kind of biased. The journal could be but you don't even know it's maybe they have a lot of bias within it. This is definitely a murkier thing, which is why you're going to really want to take a dive into the methods and see how the study was done. Let's dive into the actual paper. Now, when you look at a research paper, it reads in different sections. There's a ton of different headings and they all serve a different purpose. So I thought we'd break them down and talk about them real quick and let you know what to kind of look for in each one. First is the abstract. This is always the very first thing, and it gives you a little bit of a summary of what the whole article is about. This is helpful because it'll really tell you if you even want to bother reading the article or not. It usually gives you a look into the hypothesis, what they're trying to figure out in the study, as well as what they ended up finding. It's essentially the whole research article in a nutshell, but it in no way indicates if it's a valid study or not. You can say whatever you want in an abstract, but that does not mean that the data that you have actually done in the study supports that statement. That is why it's so important to read the whole thing and get kind of an idea of the whole picture versus the first 3 lines, which can look great, but I might not always tell the whole truth. Next is the background. And in the background section, you're going to find information about what are we even really studying here? why, and a few fun facts that the author would like you to know prior to reading the rest of this paper. Your background also has one of the most important pieces, the hypothesis, aka what you're kind of trying to prove with this whole paper. Our hypothesis for our hypothetical paper is going to be brushing your teeth leads to fewer cavities. And the paper you're reading should say something similar. We're going to try this and we hope to find this. Next, the methods. This is the part where they're going to tell you how they did the study. This is really like the meat of, is this a good article? What is their margin of error? How many people were here? What kind of study was it? How was it actually done? Like, tell me exactly how you did this. Section holds a lot and has a lot to do with what is a good study versus a study. And we're going to dive into it again in just a minute. Next are the results. To me, this is the most confusing section. This is where they talk about what they found, but through numbers. And they're going to give you a lot of numbers. This section is basically them giving you all of the numerical data that they have found by applying the methods that we just talked about to the study. Hopefully there will be some tables thrown in there to give you some visualizations of the data they're giving you. But I will say for most people, this is a really confusing section because it is very, very statistics and numbers heavy. So if you're super into that and like doing the statistical analysis bit of it, this is totally going to be your jam. But for the most part, this is not a section you're going to dive too deep into because it's just a lot of raw data. Great to reference back to if you want to look at what the actual numbers were. And the information is very important. However, like I said, it's just kind of difficult to conceptualize. Fortunately, they also include the next section, which is a discussion. And the whole point of the discussion section is to interpret the results section. Because fortunately, I'm not the only one who finds that section a little bit confusing. So what a good discussion section will do is it will give you in word form what you found in the results. What were the findings of this study? The discussion section should also address the limitations that they found while doing the study. And this is huge. If the paper lists absolutely no limitations, I want you to take a step back and imagine a red flag waving in the corner because all studies have limitations. Studies are never perfect because in the world we cannot control absolutely everything. And the authors need to let you know what didn't go quite right so you can balance that with the results that they got. The discussion section is also where they should go back and let you know how that hypothesis panned out. Did brushing your teeth regularly lead to a reduction in cavities? Yes or no? And finally, disclosures. This is a big one. In the paper you're reading, it might not have its own heading. It might be mixed into maybe the discussion section, but it needs to be there. This section tells you about the potential conflicts within the data. It should also tell you who paid for the study. And that is very important because if the study was funded or paid for by the people that own the medication or the intervention that you applied in the study, that's a biased study. For example, let's say we're doing a study saying, does Colgate toothpaste specifically, just random, reduce cavities in people? But then you go and you look and you find out Colgate was the one who paid for this study. You have to look at that with kind of a grain of salt and say, when they're looking at that, that's probably not super objective because Colgate obviously would like that result to be positive. You would like to see a difference in people who used Colgate versus not. So that study has a little bit of bias. Not saying you just should totally throw it out, but just know in the back of your mind, they were looking for that answer to be a certain way. Also, just a different tip, when you're looking at things like that, keep in the back of the mind who owns that company. So it might not be, you might look at it and be like, oh, Colgate didn't do the thing, but does Colgate have a parent company? Are they the ones that did it? You know what I mean? Just look at a few different affiliations if you're really trying to dive into it. Who funded the study? Now, let's get to the fun part and dive into the methods a little bit. Sentences I never thought I would say. Because like I said earlier, that's really where you're gonna get to find out how well this study was done. Now, the first thing you're gonna wanna find in the methods section, might even be in the title, is what kind of study is this? So I thought we'd take a moment to discuss the different type of research studies, because all research studies are not created equal. So let's start with the gold standard of research studies, which is the randomized control trial. This is the best type of study if you are trying to prove, does this intervention we're gonna do actually have an effect? And here's why. So in these types of studies, people are randomly assigned to two groups. One is the control group, aka no intervention. We're going to compare this other group to this one, the control. And then there's the intervention group, and they are going to receive the treatment that we're testing to see, is this effective? And a huge part here is the randomization. The randomization of these two groups is going to be really, really helpful in helping to reduce and limit bias in terms of age, sex, lifestyle, location, so that it's less likely that those factors will come in and also affect the data. because again, the fewer things that interfere, the more we can really look at the intervention versus no intervention and look at the two. Now, in these studies, researchers will usually try to control for all the other variables so that you're really only looking at the control and the intervention group. That way, later on down the line, when you're trying to see like, did this work, you can't blame it on something totally random. You're like, oh, that was literally the only thing that was different or mostly different in these two groups was the thing you're studying. Does that make sense? I hope so. I know, so this is all a lot, but you're doing great. Because they are random and you're trying to control for other factors, randomized controlled trials are the only types of trials that allow you to really look at cause and effect, which would demonstrate a potential efficacy of treatment. For example, with our question, is teeth brushing helpful with cavities? You're going to want to randomly assign people into a group that never brushes their teeth. That's your control group. And then you're going to assign these other random people into a group that brushes their teeth twice a day. That's your treatment group. And since this is the perfect world in our study, we're going to control every other detail of these people's lives. Maybe they live in a dorm and they're in some kind of weird experience. Maybe they're in quarantine. I don't know. But they're going to eat the same things. They're going to have the exact same lifestyle. They all live in the same place. Like everything else is the same. This would never happen, but you get the point. We're going to control all those other variables so at the end of the day we can say, oh yeah, these people had way more cavities than these people. The only thing that was different was teeth brushing. It must be the teeth brushing that caused this effect. But those are randomized control trials and those are the best. That's what we want. But those are not the only studies that exist. Let's go one level down. Now we're just going to kind of climb down a ladder and it's going to be like we started with the best and then it's like, better, on and on. So let's go down one level and look at the next best thing, which is a cohort study. These studies take groups of people and they look at them over time. And usually the goal of these studies is to look and see if disease occurs in one group versus another. And usually it's that there's something different between the groups. You know, one group did a certain thing or was exposed to certain things and the other group was not. One of the big differences between a cohort study and a randomized controlled study that we talked about is this is not random. People are kind of already in these groups naturally, or they're just not randomized. You know, there could have been like selected or volunteered. So takeaway, not random. Random is great, not random, not as great because it allows for other bias. Now there's two major different types of cohort studies. One can look forward and one can look backward. In a prospective study or one that is going to look forward, we don't know the outcome when we start. We're just going to kind of follow the two groups and see how things turn out. For example, we're going to find a group of people who don't brush their teeth, and we're going to find a group of people who do brush their teeth. We're going to follow them for 5 years, document some stuff along the way, and at the end of 5 years, we're going to look at the two groups and say, all right, groups, who had more cavities? We didn't exactly make the groups. We didn't necessarily implement stuff. They were already doing their own thing, but we still got to compare two groups who did have two different behaviors, teeth brushing versus not teeth brushing. Now, on the flip side, a retrospective study, one that looks backwards. And in these types of studies, you already have the end result and you're looking back in time to see what behaviors could have become risk factors to produce this outcome. So you're sitting there with all the data on all these cavities. You're like, wow, look at all these people that have cavities. Now let's look back over the data from the last 5 years and we have data on who brushed their teeth, who didn't, who ate a lot of sugary sweets, who reported having less sugary sweets, and see if we can put people in categories. Like, did the people who didn't brush their teeth now have more categories? Oh, maybe they do. What about the people who didn't eat a lot of sugar? Oh, they might have had less categories. You're looking backwards and making groups from people who have similar risk factors to try to gain an idea of what might have led you to this point. Like I said, these studies can't really be looked at to say any kind of causative, like, oh, that definitely caused this, because there's so much other room for bias because things weren't randomized and there wasn't a lot of control. However, these studies are wonderful if you are thinking like, ooh, I'm kind of seeing a trend here. It does look like if you brush your teeth more, you have less cavities. Let's take this and now let's do a randomized control trial with it so that we can really prove it. It's an awesome stepping stone. It's an awesome thing to look back and see trends that maybe then you want to look further into. So they're not in any way useless. They just don't necessarily give you that causative effect. The key thing to remember about these ones is they are over time and there's groups. They're just not random or super controlled. Now let's go down one more rung, a case-controlled study. Now in these studies, we compare people who have a certain medical condition with people who don't have that certain medical condition, but are otherwise fairly the same in most of their other factors. For example, this group of people has cavities, this group of people doesn't, but they all are the same age, sex, and live in the same city. These studies then look at those two groups, which are hopefully fairly similar except for that one factor, And then they ask them some questions. They say, let's see if we can find some risk factors amongst your two groups that kind of led you to where you might be today. Hey, do you brush teeth? Do you drink a lot of soda? Do you do all of these things? And then they might be able to find, oh, wow, the people in this group compared to this group don't really brush their teeth a lot and they had more cavities. Then we found by asking this no cavity group that they didn't do a lot of those same risk factor behaviors. So this is another great thing to identify risk factors that lead to certain health outcomes. Now, the big limitations with these studies are that they rely a lot on human recollection. You're asking someone, hey, like, what were your past habits? How do you recall this? Versus with a cohort study where you're documenting the data along the way. This is a one-time thing where you're saying, I'm not going to follow you. You know, we're kind of already at the end here. Let's just ask you a bunch of questions and see how this goes. So there's a lot of room for human error. And we know that human memory, I mean, not by any fault of us humans, is just not always the most reliable thing. So that's a big limitation of these studies. They're also not random. So again, they're really good for kind of identifying preliminary things to say, hey, this might be looking into and further studying a little bit, but there's really no causation here where the evidence it just isn't quite there. But again, great for trends. Now there's one more, and it's not even technically listed as like a scientific study. It's more of just like a research, like to gain some info, and that would be expert opinion. This is kind of like the lowest level of research, and it's mostly people saying like, I've done this and this is what I've seen. This is something that people do like all the time in real life, and then they do research studies on it to say like, is this legit? But if you're publishing a paper and all they have is like expert opinion, that's a lot of times called like anecdotal evidence. They could be like the smartest provider in the entire world, but that is still just, it's really not scientific evidence. So really when you're looking at that, just kind of like, ooh, if that's all they have, that's just not enough. However, it is again a great launching pad for further studies where they could really narrow things down, reduce their bias, randomize their sample, and move forward and prove their awesome point. And that's the basic scientific pyramid. Now, above the pyramid in this nice fancy cloud, there's also like systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And what those are is basically combining a ton of other research papers, hopefully randomized control trials, because as we learned, those are the best, to be like make a super paper. And why would you want to do that? Well, if you have one randomized control trial saying, hey, brushing your teeth reduces cavities, that's great. But how great would it be if you could write a paper that said, I combined the data of 12 randomized controls trials who all agreed with each other and said, brushing your teeth reduces cavities. That's a really, really strong argument and is very likely indicating that that is indeed true, and just it gives it a lot more oomph. Very technical word there. Now, the biggest thing to look at if you're coming across like a systematic review would be to make sure that the studies within the systematic review are actually legit, which hopefully you'll feel a little bit more confident assessing after watching this. Now, how do we know if a study has oomph? Very technical term. The real word would be something more like power. Don't know why I just didn't say power, but it's fine. And the oomph of the paper is kind of just like, does this hold up in court? We're gonna go and do a deep dive into the methods section. I'm gonna need you to hold on. This gets a little bit sticky. We're gonna try our hardest and we're all gonna be fine. You can do hard things, friends. You can do hard things. So when we talk about oomph or power, what we're really saying is this data that they collected, is it legit? And can it be applied to who we're trying to apply it to? And in order for us to see if a study has enough power, we're gonna have to see first, does it have enough people? The more people you have in a study, the less likely that the findings you get are there by chance. Let's go back to our cavity analogy. Let's say you're doing your study and you have come across a lucky group of people who 7 out of the 10 of them don't have cavities even though they never brush their teeth. Those people are what we would call super lucky, and if you are only taking a sample of those 10 people, that would really, really skew the data. Or conversely, what if you had people that were really prone to getting cavities and they were in your brushing your teeth group, but man, they did everything possible and they still got cavities? That's going to skew it either way because you only had 10 people. That's not a lot of people. We need samples of a lot of people to reduce the random chance that what you're seeing in your data is there by random chance versus there's an actual thing happening here. And again, how do we reduce the likelihood that something is happening by random chance in our population? We just boost up the numbers, because with that, the randoms are going to kind of be washed out by the majority. Here's another example in case you need a little bit more of a visualization. I like visualizations, in case you can't tell. Let's say you wanted to know what color are deer. So you go out in your backyard and you take pictures of 10 deer. Now, I think we all know most deer are brown, although through some genetic variances, some deer are absolutely all white. There used to be a few all white deer where we lived in Michigan, and it was the cutest thing. So hence inspiring my story. So let's say you take a picture of these 10 deer and 6 of these deer are white and only 4 are brown. So we know that that is an absolute anomaly, a total chance. And that will happen with data. We're gonna get data that's sometimes just like really weird and lucky. But you, as a researcher who only looked at the 10 deer and have no other knowledge of deer, you wouldn't know that. You would think, oh wow, most deer have white fur. How fun. But if you went out and you took pictures of 1,000 different deer, you're most likely gonna get like 990 deer with brown fur and like 10 with white fur. I don't know if that's the actual breakdown, but you know what I mean? Most deer, you're gonna realize, oh, most deer have brown fur because you had a larger sample. You reduced the outliers and the true effect was able to be shown of, yeah, most deer have brown fur. Similarly, in general, larger studies are better because they reduce the white deer, they reduce the outliers, and show us the true average. And that just gives us better context. So the very first thing you can do there is just check how many people did they actually put in this study. If it seems very tiny, approach with great caution. The second thing you're gonna wanna do here is say how many people stayed through the whole study, because a lot of studies can get a lot of people on the study, and you look at the methods, you're like, this seems really, really well done. Only to be reading through and be like, oh, of the 1,000 people they acquired for this study, 750 dropped out. So they're really only looking at data on 250 people. Watch for that, because that happens a lot. And they'll try to present it as they have 1,000 people when in reality, they only had 250, which, as we learned, can make anomalies seem much more like the majority. And jumping back to our discussion from earlier, that should be something they should let you know about in the discussion. That would be a limitation of the study, was that their dropout rate was 75%. That's not great. If they completely ignore that fact and never bring it up again, red flag. Next thing you can do in this method section after seeing how many people were involved in the study was, does it make sense? When you're looking through the methods, it will literally tell you how they do it. And if it just seems so complicated and tedious and weird, for example, like in order to be a part of the study, you had to go into the office and show them that you brushed your teeth twice a day. That's really, really weird and like gonna eliminate a lot of people. If weird things, if you're looking through it and you're like, that's just a really something odd, that seems weird. Keep that in the back of your mind. That is more of an objective, like looking at it thing. There's no perfect way to say like this is good or bad, but more of like you're looking at it and going, huh, like why'd they do it like that? Just something to keep in the back of your mind when you're looking at the methods. Next, let's dive into possibly the part that makes my brain hurt the most, confidence intervals. Now remember, I'm not like a statistics person, so I'm gonna try to make this understandable for both of us, but it's not gonna be perfect. And we're just gonna have to accept some things and move on. In a method section, or sometimes in the results, they're going to give you their confidence intervals. And the confidence interval is essentially like, how sure are you that this finding, less cavities or more cavities, is related to the intervention toothbrushing? How do you find a confidence interval? It has a lot to do with statistics. How many people are in your study, combined with how much error are you okay with seeing? This is basically the researcher saying we are 95% confident, if your confidence interval is like 95, that the data that you're seeing will be accurate. The more people, the higher your confidence. And the smaller margin of error, so if you say, I only want like a 2% margin of error, that's gonna bump your confidence interval up as well. But you will need more people in your study to be more sure and reduce that margin of error. When you're looking at these studies, you want at least a 95% confidence interval. If it's less than 95% sure, that's more than 5% that this difference that you saw could be due to something totally random and weird and not what we're actually studying. So if it's less than 95%, you can't infer any kind of causation with it because you don't really know what caused it. That's just too big of an error risk that something else could have caused it. Maybe toothbrushing worked, maybe it didn't. We don't have enough data and confidence to show us that there was actually a difference in the number of cavities between the two groups if that confidence interval is below 95%. Because remember, what you're looking for in any research study is statistical significance. I want to see a statistical significance between the number of people who have cavities who brush their teeth and the people who have cavities who did not brush their teeth. The number of cavities here, the difference between the two groups, needs to be statistically different, and we are 95% sure that that difference between the two groups is only because of the toothbrushing. That's why it's so important that we have random groups that we control for other variables so that we can see the difference between the two groups is truly just that one thing that is kind of different. And last thing, I know we're finally here, guys, last thing you really want to look at with these studies is the study needs to be representative of the population you're applying it to. What I mean by that is you can't do a study on a bunch of white women from Arkansas and then apply the study to a bunch of men in Michigan, because those samples are two very different groups of people. So your sample group, in addition to being large, needs to be very robust. You need to sample the same types of people you want to look at your data with. So with teeth brushing, you would want a range of people because you're hoping that everyone will want to brush their teeth. But if the study, conversely, is on a very niche group of people, you only need to research that niche group of people. Don't do it on a whole bunch of people and then apply it to this one very specific type of person. That just wouldn't make sense. The setting and the population of the study need to match the setting and the population that you plan to implement your research in. And those, my friends, are the basics. You made it. We all made it. I sincerely hope that that helped cleared up a few things for you, that when you go forward in the future and you come across an article on Facebook, you have a bit more confidence in diving in and understanding how to see, like, is this data legit or should I just skim past it? Because I feel like in this age, we're just receiving so much information and it's really, really hard to understand, like, was this well done? I have no idea. Everyone's like, good research. And you're like, what even is that? I hope this helped a little. If you have other tips that you use in analyzing, is this good research? Please, please, please leave them down below. We would all love to learn from you. And if seeing videos like this was helpful, I hope you consider subscribing. I make content videos and do Q&As on Tuesdays, and on Saturdays, I have a vlog documenting my life inside and out of work as an FNP, and I'd love to have you. Hope you have a fabulous rest of your week, guys, and I will see you next time. Bye.